With the breach in the Mudgate finally conquered, Stannis' soldiers invaded Blackwater Castle without significant resistance. Tyrion had been attacked by an allied soldier, but was pulled out of there by his squire. Joffrey had fled into the castle with his tail between his legs, and the completely disorganized royal guard fought desperately, but nothing could prevent defeat. Stannis' troops, led by their captains, advanced through the streets, clearing everything in their path. Cersei, who had already felt the weight of defeat in her heart, was no longer a strong and authoritative presence. She knew that if they survived the wildfire, then the fall was imminent, and the loss of her children was an unbearable possibility. When Stannis' soldiers reached the royal chambers, Cersei, in a moment of desperation, did the unthinkable. Before the enemies reached her, she, in a last act of desperation, prepared the poison she had saved for a moment like this. "I will not let them kill him, my son," Cersei said with tears in her eyes, before ending Tommen's life in the royal hall. And with one last breath of despair, she sealed her own fate with poison. The destruction of House Lannister was inevitable. With the gates finally broken down, Stannis' soldiers raised the Baratheon banner over the Gate of Baelor, symbolizing the fall of the Lannisters. The city lay in ruins, and victory seemed to have been won at a very high price. However, when the soldiers reached the Iron Throne, a macabre scene awaited them. Cersei, poisoned, was dead, and around her Tommen had also perished. Checking the halls where the ladies were hiding, they saw some courtesans, Sansa and other servants, all brutally murdered. Ilan Payne, the executioner, was responsible for carrying out Cersei's orders in case everything went wrong. The battle was over, but the price of victory was a city stained with blood and betrayal. While Stannis Baratheon consolidated his victory over Blackwater, news of his rise to power quickly reached Tywin Lannister's ears. The patriarch of House Lannister, already facing a precarious situation due to pressure from Robb Stark's forces, was in a critical position. His attempt to negotiate with the Tyrells had failed. The alliance with House Tyrell, which had once seemed secure, had been weakened by mistrust and power games, and his family's longtime allies were drifting away. The siege of King's Landing, with his armies scattered and without effective support, meant that Tywin was unable to arrive in time to save Cersei. The city was already lost, and the Lannisters found themselves increasingly isolated. Tywin, seeing his influence crumble, knew that Cersei's death was only the beginning of a long road of losses. He was, in fact, between a rock and a hard place. The Starks in the north were gaining ground, and he could not wait any longer to react. The siege of King's Landing had been a decisive defeat, and he found himself forced to retreat, taking his armies away from the Riverlands. Now he had to focus on maintaining what remained of his power, without losing any more essential allies. However, the greatest humiliation for the Lannisters came when Stannis captured Joffrey. The young king, who had always been a symbol of arrogance and cruelty, was finally caught during the court's disorganized escape. The fear in his eyes was evident, and he was unable to resist when Stannis' soldiers surrounded him. "You will pay for your actions, Joffrey Baratheon, or rather bastard fruit of incest," Stannis said coldly, as he dragged him through the city. The young monarch's humiliation was complete, and his life came to an end not as a king, but as a prisoner. Stannis, already consumed by religious fervor and the desire to consolidate his reign, ordered Joffrey's public execution. In the center of the square, a bonfire was lit, and the people, who had once feared the sadistic king, now watched his death with a sense of justice being served. To them, it didn't matter who wore the crown. The fire quickly consumed Joffrey, and the crowd applauded the scene, seeing the end of a tyrant. "The Lord of Light has done justice today," proclaimed Melisandre, as she watched the execution closely. The kingdom had changed, and the Baratheon line was approaching a new era, but not without sacrifices. Meanwhile, Myrcella, who was in Dorne, was still safe. Without Joffrey's presence to instigate hatred from the other kingdoms, and without Cersei's support to protect her in King's Landing, she was out of the line of fire. The fate of the Lannister princess seemed more favorable than that of her brothers. However, the kingdom was about to plunge into a new wave of turmoil, and no one knew how long Myrcella's relative safety could be maintained. After the defeat, Tywin Lannister found himself once again face to face with Tyrion, his despised and hated son. The reunion was not a moment of reconciliation, but a confrontation filled with resentment and bitterness. Tyrion's face was badly injured, and he could barely hide the marks of battle. However, his attitude remained firm. "Did you call me here for this, father? To blame me even more for the consequences of the war your lovely grandson provoked?" said Tyrion, looking at the old man with contempt, feeling the bitter taste of defeat. "With Cersei dead and Jaime imprisoned with the Starks, I am left with only the dwarf to continue the Lannister line," Tywin replied sarcastically, casting a cold glance at his son. Tywin's words were cruel, but they revealed the harsh reality in which House Lannister found itself. "But if the rumors are true, our dear Myrcella is much more Lannister than the two of us put together, father," Tyrion said. But not because he despised Myrcella. No, he loved her dearly and was happy to know she was alive. He said it to further provoke the man who had treated him like a plague since he was born. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Tywin's voice, which, with growing anger, began to accuse Tyrion of everything that had gone wrong. "You destroyed our family! If it weren't for your idiocy, we might still have something to save," he said with disdain. Tyrion, tired of his father's empty words, replied calmly, but with a touch of venom. "What else did you expect from a man as inferior as me? Perhaps if you had treated me better, we wouldn't be here now." Tywin, enraged, slammed his fist on the table, but he knew there was nothing left to do but retreat and try to save what was left. His plans for expansion and domination were in ruins. Now, Tywin's focus was on strengthening the family's defenses, retreating, and rebuilding the armies, waiting for an opportunity to return to power and rescue Jaime, who, upon hearing of Cersei's death, had lost hope in absolutely everything. With the victory at Blackwater, Stannis Baratheon finally took the crown. But what he had won was much more than a simple title. The city was in ruins, but under his leadership it began to rebuild itself. He ordered the fortification of castles and fortresses, had the defenses of King's Landing reinforced, and began to ruthlessly reorganize the military forces. In addition, Stannis, with his unshakable faith in the Lord of Light, proclaimed that the new god would be the only one worshipped in the kingdom. In his speech he declared, "Now the only god will be the Lord of Light. The old and new gods have been defeated, and their images will be destroyed." He then ordered the temples of the old gods to be razed, as well as the altars and figures of the deities that had dominated the kingdom for so long. For Stannis, his victory was a sign that the Lord of Light had finally given his blessing to Westeros, and he was determined to eliminate any trace of a past he considered corrupt. The Lannister era was, in fact, coming to an end, and a new reign was beginning, based on the faith and strength of Stannis Baratheon. As time passed, Stannis Baratheon, although he had decisively won the crown, soon realized that the stability of his reign was more complex than he had imagined. The victory over the Lannisters and the bloodshed in the capital were not enough to win acceptance for his government. In his relentless pursuit of power, he distanced himself from the people and the nobles, who began to question his actions. Under Stannis' command, the streets of King's Landing became even more austere. Temples were destroyed in the name of the Lord of Light, and the population found itself subjugated not only by the hardships of war, but also by the imposition of a new religion that did not win hearts. Stannis, though efficient, had not known how to cultivate loyalty through symbolic gestures or generosity toward those who supported him. His rule, as rigid as it was relentless, began to cause discontent among all those who expected something more. With the capital still under reconstruction, Stannis, confident in his position as absolute leader, ordered all other rulers and regents of Westeros to travel to King's Landing, to swear allegiance to him as the new king of the Seven Kingdoms. The order was clear. No one would be exempt. However, Robb Stark, King of the North, responded with a direct blow to Stannis' face. In a message sent, Robb categorically refused to take the oath. "I am the King of the North," he wrote, with the strength of one who knew he could defy the new king. "The North will be independent, and no one will force us to kneel before a king from the South." Robb's response was a cry for independence that reverberated throughout the North. The refusal was a declaration of war, and Stannis knew he could not ignore it. Melisandre, with her blind faith in the Lord of Light and her mastery of the mystical arts, saw an opportunity to consolidate Stannis' power by eliminating the greatest obstacle to his rule, Robb Stark. She knew that shadow magic was a powerful and lethal tool, capable of ensuring anyone's death, provided the ceremony was performed correctly. Stannis, without hesitation, gave his permission and his seed for Melisandre to perform the spell in a dark ritual deep within his tents. The sacrifice would be made, and the King of the North would fall before he could challenge Stannis' authority again. On a moonless night, Melisandre performed the magic, summoning the shadow of a child born of fire and darkness. Robb Stark was taken by surprise by the magic, and the murderous shadow emerged from the darkness to stab him in the heart. Robb's death was swift and ruthless, and his fall weakened the resistance of the North. However, the manner of his death was not viewed favorably by all, and many within the North began to see Stannis as a usurper who used dishonorable methods to achieve his goals. The betrayal that Stannis allowed spread like wildfire across the lands of the North, and the loyalty of his followers was from then on increasingly questioned. As the King of the North fell, Tywin Lannister, who had always been a pragmatic man, was quick to see that his future was tied to Stannis' victory. He knew that his own power was in decline, especially with Jaime's capture, and that only an alliance with the new king could guarantee his survival. In a tense meeting where the words of both sides were sharper than blades, Tywin knelt, but not before making it clear that his oath of allegiance was conditional on the return of his son Jaime. "You and I both know that a Lannister never forgets a debt," Tywin said in a firm voice. "Help me recover my son, and I will swear allegiance to the Lord of Light, or whichever of those deities you choose. Otherwise, your plans to rule the kingdom will be limited to that empty castle in King's Landing." Stannis, aware of the strategic advantage that an alliance with Tywin represented, accepted the deal. With the alliance formalized, Tywin brought with him not only the weight of his house, but also the support of old allies. Together, Tywin and Stannis formed an unbeatable front to attack the last strongholds of resistance, including the Starks themselves, who were beginning to lose control of their lands. Stannis' strategy was clear: crush any vestige of resistance and take absolute control. The war for control of Westeros intensified when Stannis, with Tywin at his side, marched north, defeating the forces that still opposed his rule. When Stannis and Tywin's forces reached Winterfell, the Starks were in retreat. There were no major battles, but rather a series of brutal skirmishes that weakened the morale of the resistance. With the death of Robb Stark and the surrender of his allies, Stannis was able to take control of the last strongholds of the North. When he arrived at King's Landing, he raised his banner with the flame of the Lord of Light over the Seven Kingdoms. The resistance was crushed, and those who opposed him were defeated or forced to kneel. With Robb's death and the surrender of his forces, Stannis Baratheon's kingdom was consolidated. Tywin Lannister once again had his favorite son by his side. Together, they had defeated the last vestiges of opposition and restored order under Stannis' crown. The King of the Seven Kingdoms was finally proclaimed, but the sense of achievement came at a price. The kingdom was broken, and its unification had been achieved by force. While the Seven Kingdoms bowed before Stannis, the fire of the Lord of Light seemed to burn brighter than ever, but the future of the kingdom was still far from assured.